Hi, seventh grade. Today we are learning about natural selection. So first, I'm just going to take you on a quick vacation to this place called the Galapagos Islands, which is an island off of South America. It's kind of like in the middle of nowhere. A really long time ago, there was this guy named Charles Darwin. I'm going to write that down. There was a scientist named Charles Darwin, and he visited the Galapagos Islands. And he saw a bunch of like really weird wildlife, like those huge turtles, but he saw a variety of really strange wildlife that people back in the 1800s had never seen before. And he noticed something really cool about some of the birds on this island. So here's just a little, like, quick little map of where the Galapagos Islands is. Here's Mexico. Here's Colombia. I was there for spring break. And then here's the Galapagos Islands. They're very, like, far away from the rest of the world. But he noticed something really cool about these birds in 1831. And first, I just want you to think about, what do you notice about these birds? And why do you think that is? So one thing I noticed about these birds is that they all have different beaks. They kind of have like the same eyes, the same color, the same like head shape, but the only thing that really differs between them is the shape of their beaks. And the reason for that Charles Darwin, after he studied these finches, is that these finches, or this type of bird called a finch, their beaks are adapted depending on what the bird likes to eat. So maybe, for example, this bird likes to eat seeds that are really small, and this bird loves to eat beaks or seeds that are like really, really big and tough to open. So he needs an adapted beak to be able to break open those seeds. This bird probably likes seeds that are in really hard to get spaces, so he needs to have a pointy beak to get there. And then this bird, he just likes to eat different kinds of seeds. But the cool thing about this is these finches, they're all like pretty much the same type of bird. But the thing that's different is that these birds eventually adapted or changed depending on what helped them eat better. They ate easier, they found food way easier to find and easier to eat when these species finally adapted to have different types of beaks. Now, that is called, the vocabulary word in science for that is variation. As you can see, it sounds a lot like variación. That just basically means that there's a range of physical traits and also behaviors among members of a species. So within a species, so for example, within all these birds, you notice that there was variation. They had different beaks. Even though they were all the same species, there were little differences between them, the differences in their physical traits that kind of helped them to survive and live better. Another example of this that we see in pretty much everyday life is the variation between or within the apple species. So, variation in apples. You've probably noticed that not all apples are the same. Some are red, some are green. My favorite type of apple is actually the Honeycrisp. Some people really like Granny apples. Some people really like those really red ones. I actually don't like those like at all, but there's a variation. They change. There's a range of different traits that all these apples have, even though they're of the same species. And now there's also this example of tigers. So these are all tigers, but there's variation in the species of tigers. You've probably, if you've been to a number of zoos before, maybe you've seen different types of tiger. Like there are white tigers, there are like those really chunky tigers. They have different variations of patterns and colors. They have different head shapes. There's variation. And we see that in almost all like living things. And so that is basically like what Charles Darwin discovered, is that within species, there's a lot of variation, there's a lot of changes. And why is this important? Why did variation happen? Well, you can probably imagine that it's important that some species are better adapted to certain environments than others. For example, this like white looking wolf probably is able to hunt a lot better because everything around him is white too. And now this brown colored wolf is definitely better able to camouflage in his environment because of the color. Now, if this wolf was white, that would be pretty bad. All their prey would be able to see them. And if this wolf was like pink or something, that would also be pretty bad because then they wouldn't be able to hunt very well. So it's important that species can have this variation so they can survive in their own different environments. So the main point there is that variation increases a species' chance of survival in the environment. In the wild, it's all about survival. And you can think of variation as like different tools, or like how animals, yeah, they have like different tools to help them survive. Like some animals have different types of camouflage. Those finches had different types of beaks to help them like cut open and break open the fruits and seeds that would help them survive. So whenever you see the word variation, think about like the range or of like different physical traits that increases the chance of survival. Like, it's always about survival when we're talking about like genetics in the wild. So variation, we get it, it's really important, but how does variation happen? Well, that's all about natural selection. Natural selection is this really huge concept in biology of how basically, well, the best way that I can explain it is survival of the fittest. But we'll definitely go more into depth. Here's the definition of natural selection: the organism with the best adaptations for a specific environment will survive, and then not only will they survive, they'll be able to pass those adaptations down to their offspring. So the keywords here in this definition are definitely like adaptations, survive, and pass down. So what it's saying is natural selection is the idea that if you are the fittest to survive in your environment, you have the best adaptations, you have the best tools, you will survive. And not only will you survive, you'll have offspring that also have those awesome adaptations so that you can just continue passing down like all the great adaptations that you have for that environment. Let's go ahead and like unpack that. One easy way to remember this, by the way, is survival of the fittest. So we need a couple things in order for natural selection to work out. First things first, there must be variation in the population, which means within like a group of animals, when in the same species, there has to be variation, and there always is. Like, think about humans. We are very varied. We have different skin colors, we have different heights, and think about it in animals too. For example, not all giraffes are the same height. In fact, a lot of like giraffes have usually they have different heights, and especially if you think about it in terms of evolution over like the thousands of years that giraffes have been alive, there's a bunch of different heights of giraffes. So their height is the variation. That's the thing that changes. Now, not only do you need to have this variation, but you also need for there to be one trait or more, but one trait that is more advantageous. That means like advantage, a trait that's better, that's going to help you survive. So, oh, the definition is right there. It gives the organism an advantage and it helps it to survive. So, if we're still talking about giraffes, for example, let's say that the variation was the height, right? Now look at this, just look at this little picture here for a second. One giraffe is way taller and the other giraffe was born short. And look how tall the trees are. If we're thinking about how natural selection is all about like who is going to survive, who do you think is going to survive in this situation? Well, the giraffes with taller genes. So maybe this giraffe had the TT genotype, maybe this giraffe had the little t genotype to make it short. Well, unfortunately, only few animals can survive in the wild and only the best are going to survive. So let's see what's going to happen. Um but well, there was supposed to be a picture here, but okay, I'll just tell you. Basically what happens is that this giraffe, he is going to die, unfortunately. And this one is going to live to reproduce. And so what's going to happen after that? So this already happened. There was variation, and the advantageous trait for the giraffe was that he was taller. Now all the tall giraffes are going to survive, while all the short giraffes are more likely to die off because they can't get the food that they need to survive. So what happens is that all the tall giraffes, or all the organisms with the advantageous trait, they are going to reproduce and create offspring that also have that trait. There's the key word right there, or like there's the key phrase. If you survive and you have the better trait, the advantageous trait, not only will you survive, you're going to pass that on to your kids as well. And then your kids are going to pass that on, and so on and so forth. And then over time, the interesting thing about that is that over time, these traits become very common in the whole population. So if you look at giraffes now, a lot of them are really, really tall. That's because all the tall giraffes survived and kept having more kids, and then those kids were tall and had more tall kids and more tall kids, while all the short giraffes were dying off. And if you die off, you do not get to have kids that are short. No, so over time, if you had the disadvantage trait, the trait that didn't help you survive, that trait is eventually going to die off because everybody with that like crappy trait is going to eventually die off if they have to compete with all the individuals with the good trait, with the adaptation. So that's basically how natural selection works. So, quick check for understanding. Does natural selection occur in an individual, organism, or in a population? So this actually occurs in a population. So for example, if we have a lot of tall giraffes, and then we have some short giraffes, natural selection happens among this population. There's a competition between them, right? Not just in one giraffes. And then over time, of course, they're going to pass it on to the next generations while these giraffes die off. So it does happen in a population. Here's a really good, like in real life example of natural selection over time. So there's this moth that biologists study very often called the peppered moth. And interestingly enough, within the last 200-ish years, this peppered moth, the whole population of moths, like the millions of like peppered moths around the world, have changed color over time through natural selection. So let's just take a look at these two peppered moths. There's variation here. Because even though they're the same type of moth, one was accidentally born black and one was accidentally born white. And this is just because of mutations. This just randomly happens sometimes. That's why we have variation, right? It's like if somebody was born with blue eyes and somebody was born with brown eyes. So maybe this moth has, where's my eraser? Maybe this moth has like the phenotype of MM, and this moth has a phenotype of capital M, capital M. So in the environment that peppered moths live in, they live in England. mostly. There's a lot of trees that have this pattern. So this is tree bark. Notice how the white peppered moth camouflages really, really well. Whereas the black peppered moth, you can kind of see it like way better than the white peppered moth. How do you think this is going to affect their chances of survival? Well, oops, let me not go to that slide yet. Turns out that if you are a black peppered moth, you will get eaten by birds way quicker. So this was disadvantageous. And this being white was advantageous. Because basically a bunch of birds, there's like no camouflage here. And a bunch of birds are gonna see you versus this guy who is very camouflaged. And all the black peppered moths started to die off. Natural selection made this guy, the white peppered moth, be the winner. He survived and passed on his white coat to the next generation of white moths. So for a while, for many years, the peppered moth, they were all mostly white because the black peppered moths died off. And then the white peppered moths were able to pass on that the trait of being white to their kids. But then something really interesting happened. And what happened was that all the trees in England started to turn black. Why did that happen? Well, the trees started turning black because of the human invention of factories. I literally am not making this up. When England started to have their industrial boom and started making a ton of factories, all that pollution turned all of their trees a darker shade. Their trees started to turn black because they were polluting their environment like crazy. Now, think about the peppered moths. Which of these moths do you think is going to survive and be able to pass down their trait to the next generation? Well, obviously the black peppered moth, because the black peppered moth now is able to camouflage. And even though there were very few black peppered moths, these white moths started dying off like crazy. They cannot pass down their traits to the next. They can't have kids. But these guys are going to have kids, and they're going to make a bunch more black peppered moths. And that is the story of natural selection. So if you understand that story and how that works, and the fact that like why the black peppered moth survives now, that's natural selection. Whoever has the better adaptation, in this case the adaptation is the color, that will survive, and then the whole population will eventually mostly have that adaptation so that their whole species can live better. So black moths now have the best adaptations for their environment. They survived, reproduced, and made more black moths. Currently, the number of black moths have increased while the number of white moths have decreased. So, I mean, just looking at this picture, you can tell that this white moth is going to be seen by birds and other predators much more easily and will die more easily. And so for some of us who just need to see things in numbers more, imagine it this way. So for the first generation of peppered moths, there were 50 black ones and then 50 white moths, even Steven. But then in the second generation, the trees started turning black. Well, now the white moths have decreased and the black moths have increased. They were able to live and reproduce and create more black moths. And then generation 3, well, those kids had more black moth kids, and now they're at 200, while the white moths are still dying because those trees are still black. They're easily spotted by birds and they will die. And then by the 4th generation, there's 400 black moths because then those kids had more black moth babies while the white moth continue to die off. And so over time, we're going to have very few white moths and a lot of black moths due to natural selection. So it's a process. It happens over time. It doesn't happen overnight. And oh, well, this is literally what I just said. Natural selection does not happen overnight. It happens over generations, which is why major evolutionary changes happen over thousands of years. So going back to that giraffe example, I didn't just make it up out of nowhere. This is a fossil of, I'm not sure how old it is, but it's a fossil of old giraffes. And look at how small that giraffe is. I don't know if you can tell from this picture, but like, this is like the height of a human. So there's proof that natural selection works out. All those short giraffes of olden days did not survive to pass down that short trait. Only the tall only the tall survive. And so all we have of our little short giraffes are just fossils of them, because now, since these small giraffes died off, most of our giraffes are now going to be tall. And over generations, they stay tall or get taller. So check for understanding. Does this change happen during one generation, or does it take multiple generations? This takes multiple generations. So for example, with the black moths, happened over generations, and then the example with the fossils tells you that it happens over generations. So lots and lots of years, lots of babies. All right, so let's go ahead and do an example together. Let's think through this problem. A population of birds lives in a forest. Some birds have long, sharp beaks. Other birds have short, dull beaks. The ones with sharp beaks are better at catching insects. The ones with dull beaks are better at eating fruit. One year, a disease kills all the fruit. So, long-beaked bird catches bugs. Short-beaked bird eats fruits. All right, so what is the variation in this population? Variation, again, is like the trait that changes within a population. And so the variation here would be the shape of beaks. That's what changed. We have some beaks that are short, some beaks that are long. Which of these traits would be advantageous? Which one would help them survive? Think about the fact that a disease kills all the fruits one year. So the advantageous trait here would be sharp beaks, because they can eat insects when fruits die. Which individuals are more likely to survive and reproduce? The birds with long, sharp beaks or the birds with short, dull beaks? Well, the birds with long, sharp beaks, if all the fruit die and the only choice they have is to eat insects, they're already good at that. They already have a long enough beak to be able to eat insects, so they're going to survive if all the fruits die off. Meanwhile, this buddy, he can't catch insects, and he doesn't have any fruit to eat. So, unfortunately, he does not survive. Which trait do you think will become more and more common for each generation? So, for example, if this generation of birds has children, which one do you think, which trait would be passed on? Well, the sharp beaks would be passed on because, well, again, like this one survives and this one dies. So then his kids will probably also have really long beaks. Why do you predict this will become more common? Long beaks survive, and then the short beaks die because they have no food. If the population changes over time, is this an example of natural selection? Yes, because this is natural selection because the species with a bad trait dies off, and the species with the advantageous trait even like survives and passes that on to many generations. So eventually, in this species, if the fruit continue to die, most of the species in like 100 years will have long beaks. So go ahead, in your own words, write a couple sentences. How does the story of the peppered moth represent natural selection? And then here is our next CFU. Oh, weird. A population of birds walks along the shores of a swampy area, eating small crabs. So we're talking about birds eating crabs in a swamp. Climatic changes cause the water level in the area to increase. Which genetic variation in the bird population will be an advantage, leading to greater survival in the area? So if I am a bird, here's my bird, and here's the water, and you're looking for crabs. Well, over time, it says that the water level increases. That means that the water is now up to here. Which of these choices would lead to a greater survival? Longer legs for wading, a thicker coat of feathers, shorter, stronger beaks, or sharper talons on the feet? The answer is longer legs. So for these kinds of questions, think about like, what is the change in the environment? Well, the water level increased. And then think about what specifically, which trait is going to best like make my species survive. So if there happens to be one little guy with a variation of really long legs who people used to make fun of him back in the day, but then he was the one who survived, even though he had weirdly long legs. He survived and passed it on to his kids, and now all of his kids have longer legs and are able to survive the rising water levels. That's natural selection. Number 2, the habitat of a rabbit undergoes a rise of 2 degrees Celsius above normal. What variation will increase in the population in response to the change? So knowing about natural selection, we want to find an adaptation that would be good for our rabbits, knowing that it is getting way hotter up in here. So if you have your little rabbit and it's getting really, really, really hot, what variation will help this rabbit's population survive? Wider eyes that take in more light, no way. Large ears that radiate heat, that means that heat is let out. Maybe. Longer whiskers, vibrations have nothing to do with the heat. Stronger hind legs for running faster, that's nice, but we're not really talking about like, oh, they need to run faster. We're just talking about how hot it's getting. So the only answer choice that makes the most sense is letter B. All right, and to summarize what we learned, Charles Darwin was a scientist who discovered natural selection by studying how the finches in the Galapagos Islands had really weird and varied beaks. They all had, even though they were all finches, they had different types of mouths. Natural selection is about how populations adapt to their environments. Like, how are you best going to survive this environment with the tools and the body that you have? And then number 3, populations that have advantageous features, meaning that these are better, live and pass it on to the next generation, while ones with disadvantageous features die off. So one of the key things that people like tend to forget about natural selection is that it has to be able to be passed on, or else it doesn't count. So if Miss Aquino has like weird telepathy powers that are advantageous, but I don't have kids and I don't pass that on, then that's not natural selection. That's just a mutation. You have to be able to, that population needs to be able to pass it on to their kids over generations for it to be called natural selection. So that's that. Let me know if you guys have any questions, and good luck with your work today.